HaTorah Tova, HaTorah, HaTorah Tova. But Yeshua's the way, the truth, and the life.
All right, so this week we are in Pinchas, and we know that that's about the, a guy who was zealous for Yahweh and set things right. But I want to do a comparison with Pinchas. And here's the setting. We have the second generation of Israelites, and they're in the desert, and they've done what their parents couldn't do, and they're finally seating, saying, God, everything, you're in control. You're driving this place. We trust you completely. And what happens? Well, there's things that happen. We have Baal Peor. So first, Israel began to commit harlotry with the daughters of Moab, and these women called Israel to sacrifice to their gods, and then the people ate, and they bowed down to their gods, and that's exactly what Balaam had wanted to happen, and Israel fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. But that should remind us of something, and this is where I want to do my comparison. Where else do we see worship and bowing down and sacrifice, etc., a feast, so to speak? Well, it wasn't too long ago that we studied the sin of the golden calf. And I want to look at those side by side because they're very similar. Well, you may say, well, one is sexual and one is not, but the term that's used for rise, the term that's used here, lesek, is actually often has a sexual connotation to it. And so after the people of Israel built the calf, they sacrificed their burnt offerings, their peace offerings, they sat down to eat and drink, and then they rose. And the Torah often uses that term for sexual activity, letzach. Anyway, so you can look at Rashi and Joseph, and there's a lot more explanation on that, but I want to get right into it because both stories in Baal Peor and the golden calf, they are stories of idolatry. And they involve what? They involve worship. They involve a sacrifice. They involve a feast. And they have this link between idolatry and sexual promiscuity. So, and what does Yahweh say in Exodus 34:15? He says, don't forge a covenant with other nations because you'll stray after their gods and the people will call you and you'll eat of their offerings. And that's exactly what's going on in Baal Peor, even though we were warned about it at the golden calf. Yeah, Yahweh warns about us at the golden calf, and yet we did it anyway. And so these stories are related in part because in the golden calf, idolatry led to promiscuity, but in Baal Peor, it's interesting that promiscuity led to idolatry. That order is reversed. And with that, what is the Torah? The Torah is actually telling us that promiscuity and idolatry are fundamentally expressions of what? The very same thing. Because we see the linking of these stories. Think about that. Idolatry and sexual promiscuity. Well, I know even in the Hebrew roots movement, people sometimes, in every movement, those that call themselves believers or those people of faith and Christians, sometimes sexual sin is big. It's just something that happens, and it's not right. It's still a sin, but it's interesting that idolatry and sexual promiscuity are linked, because what is that? Activity like that is actually a tool. That intimacy is supposed to build a deep and real and loving relationship. And those that choose to be involved for just pleasure or for the moment or whatever it is, they've sort of totally obscured what it's all about. They've obscured the intimacy with Yahweh even. So, and what's at the core of of idolatry? Idolatry takes the worship, the very thing that's supposed to be used to build that intimacy with our loving Yahweh, with our loving God, that relationship, and it's twisting it. And so we see how these idolatry and this intimacy issue, they go this promiscuity issue, they're hand in hand, and they're sort of the same thing, because polytheistic worship is not about creating a deep, intimate relationship. It's about pleasing the God you're worshiping, whether it's your job or your power or the man or the woman you're with or yourself or whatever it may be. So this promiscuity is meant to be a tool, or is taking what is meant to be beautiful between you and God, that intimacy, and it's using it for selfish, superficial pleasure. Idolatry and sexual promiscuity go hand in hand. And so this idolater and the adulterer, that you deceive yourself into thinking that you can have your cake and you can eat it too. So, you abuse the tools that bring you to intimacy with Yahweh. And when you remove the relationship, when you cheapen what God's tried to do with it, you cheapen what he's made beautiful. And that's why we see Pinchas, and the sin of Baal Peor, how we see him stop the sexual activity to stop the plague. We might think, well, it would have made more sense for Pinchas to impale someone worship Baal Peor. But when you link these two stories together, no, actually it makes sense for him to do what he did, because they're really two. The golden calf and Baal Peor are two expressions of the same thing. And remember, I said that word lasak often means concerns sexual activity, and you see that in both. So in doing what Pinchas did in impaling the couple, he redeems that intimacy, that perversion of what was done. That perversion, the potential for that intimacy to be used and sacrificed in worship. He redeems that. He's saying, no, this is not going to be allowed. We worship but one God, and it is Yahweh himself. And maybe that's what the Torah wants us to learn in the parallels of the two stories, because whichever comes first, promiscuity or adultery, or idolatry and promiscuity, it has that propensity to take something that's meant to create intimacy and devalue it. And that's what we do, folks. We devalue it. So they really go hand in hand. And so we need to see, where do we struggle? Because do we fail to recognize God where he's supposed to be? Do we give intimacy to something else, that time and that other relationship, whatever it is, and we don't give that intimacy to Yahweh? If so, have we made an idol of that thing? And that idol and that sexual intimacy go hand in hand. The sin of the golden calf and Baal Peor, they each happen right after a major turning point in the relationship, the nation's relationship with Yahweh. And that should teach us something too, because we can come to him, but then we have to work on maintaining that relationship. Or any relationship takes time. It takes effort. It takes conversation. And maybe that's where we struggle. We come to him. Do we maintain that time? Do we tithe of our time? Because guess what? Malachi 3:10 is not just about the tithe. It's about your time too. Do we steal something from him, something from Yahweh, and keep it and hold it close to us, or give it to something else? If we were honest, we'd have to say yes. So that means we're entering into that very same sin in a way. So because we have got to put effort into maintaining our relationship with him. Baal Peor and the golden calf, I think we got to look at them together, and we can understand holiness and intimacy and idolatry and promiscuity. And that's what I have to say for today.
It's I don't know exactly where I've heard it, but because I listened to so many different things and pick and choose and separate the wheat from the chaff, but I have heard, statistics, I guess. Where do they get these? Who do they talk to? I don't know. But when the quarantine happened, they took like 6 weeks of quarantine, and the churches were shut down. And who was it that came back with statistics that within 6 weeks of not going to church, men and women both were now turning to pornography and all kinds of different things, just simply because they weren't gathering together and didn't have the support. And it wasn't just pornography, but a lot of other things, but mostly pornography, because that's the number one thing and it's not just men anymore,
No,
by the way, and all this kind of thing. It really does come down to what you value. You're 100% right, and it's where do we focus. Interesting word. I heard this about 427 times yesterday. We had our Keeping Focus conference, but it's keeping that focus instead of letting things go awry. And do we really need the interaction so much that we can't get separated from other people without separating ourselves from God? You see what I'm saying? I don't remember where I got the statistics. I don't remember who said it. I don't remember the validation of it or whatever like that, but I don't doubt it. I just really don't doubt it. And it's too bad that we don't have enough confidence in ourselves to keep that integrity up, to keep the integrity between us and God without having to have a support system there. But different people have different weaknesses. Everybody's different. I can't speak for someone else. I can only speak for myself, but it's a sad day, in this sense. And I mean, what you were saying is real interesting, because I think it's one of those subjects that is not brought out enough. Maybe we're scared to talk about it because it might spark something in somebody that stays away from it because they have a weakness. I've thought about this is that sometimes you don't talk about things because maybe the people that hear these things have a weakness towards that, and by bringing it up and talking about it, it brings it to mind. I used to have a friend that he had a big weakness towards pornography, and he fought it off and did real well. And from what this is an extremely private thing, so you don't really ever know. But towards his testimony, he was constantly, claiming that this was all in his past. But one of the biggest things he would say is that sin is only a click away. My weakness is only a click away, and it's true, because on the internet now, it makes no difference. Within 1, 2, or 3 clicks, you can now be full force into any pornography that you want to be into, and it's a heavy weakness. And once again, getting heavier in time. It's not just men. It's becoming almost as equal with women.
I agree. I still call, and for years, pretty much since we've had the congregation, I've always said, the novels that so many women read, they're porn.
Oh yeah, by far. If it puts the thought up here, even if it's just in the imagination, doesn't necessarily mean it has to be in your eyes.
But let's look at movies today. What is normal?
I'm with you.
Movies today would have been considered pornography.
I'm with you.
Ago.
Yeah, I mean,
and that's in almost everything that's there. So you look around, the the billboards that are up along the guys. I mean, that is it's everywhere. It is everywhere. So, but so is the sexual sin. Because it's far beyond pornography. I mean, it's almost kids feel pressure if they remain pure, purity, that they're ridiculed. I've heard that even on some of they have, we don't have the main channels, but on some of those channels, they have programs where you meet, relationship programs.
Right.
And I'll just give you an example. It's Married at First Sight. Okay. They have somebody there that's a virgin and they're like 30 something years old. And it made others wonder, would you really want a partner that was a virgin? Because that means there's something wrong. There's something wrong with them. And you really want to have that sexual experience, lots of it, before you ever get married. And they almost demonized, well, not almost, they did demonize the person that's maintained purity. And that's the way, isn't that exactly what we've been saying? Even really the whole good is bad and bad is good. Evil, it's exactly what the word said in that day, in that hour, and that's where we are. And it's idolatry. If it feels good, do it. Isn't that the motto? So if it feels good, do it, then it's removed any kind of sin factor in some people's mind. And if you're not in congregation, there's something that happens when you attend a congregation. If you're dealing with so-called, the world would say sillily demons, but even that kind of stuff, spiritual junk, as well as sin in your life, if you're attending a congregation, if you haven't gotten rid of it, it still keeps it at bay. And that's why we see what you said, Mark. It's coming out when people stopped gathering for the congregation. In the congregation, that kind of stuff manifested. It came to the surface because nothing was holding it at bay. And so if you can remove, I'm taking up your time. If they can remove our congregational worship, our congregational setting, then they can have a whole bunch of, the beast returns inside of us and we're led by the beast instead of by the Spirit. And then we go play for the other team.
It's exactly right. You're right there. I'm actually taking notes here for our segment here. And because this is really good. I don't know how to spell. That's my deal. No, it's just not talked about. Literally, there's so many other issues, yet this is a number one issue. Where are the Pinchases?
Where are they?
Yeah, where are they? Kind of what we're doing here to a very minute extent is, bringing it up and talking about it, period, is a minute little Pinchas, but at least we're doing it. And it's interesting. I don't think I've ever heard anybody teach it that way, though, the way that you just brought it up. And you're always unique, very unique in things.
You always tell me that.
You are, though.
That's good. That's what I want to be. I don't, everybody needs to be who they are. They don't need to copy somebody else. So,
well, let's take it right on into the Brit Hadashah here with John 2:13 to 22. Yeshua cleanses the temple. Of course, this is where he goes into the temple and finds those who are selling oxen and sheep and pigeons and the money changers, and making a whip of cords. He drives them out of the temple with the sheep and oxen, and then he pours out the coins of the money chambers and overturns their tables. He tells those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembers that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me," speaking of Yeshua. And then the Jews said to him, and of course, this is in a different verse, kind of separated. I'm not so sure that it's all a part of this. They're saying this to him because of what he did there, but I guess it just fits, editing there in the Brit Hadashah. The Jews say to him, what sign do you show us for doing these things? And Yeshua says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up again. The blah, blah, blah. It says it's taken 46 years to build a temple. He's actually speaking of the temple of his body. And so my deal was that of him speaking in parables. And so many of the parables that he spoke, they just didn't understand. Even his disciples really just didn't understand. And it makes me bring it into today's perspective, even with what we just talked about. You're talking about Pinchas and what he did, why he did, the promiscuity, that type of thing. Being very clear, when we teach these days, we try to be as clear about the subject and not really so much give examples, except examples out of the Torah. And we don't speak in parables, so to say, as much like as Yeshua. It's almost as though he planned on doing it. And so many times I forget, why do you do that? Why wasn't he clearer both to the Pharisees, the leaders of the time, and to his disciples? And I looked it up, Matthew 13, 10 is where the disciples came to him and says, why do you speak to the people in parables? And he replied, because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, Yeshua says, has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. This is why I speak to them in parables. And he goes on with, though seeing, they do not see, though hearing, they do not hear or understand. In them is full of the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes because you see, and your ears because they hear. For truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. And then he goes on to the parable of the sower. And it makes me wonder whether or not people are mixing so much of the world with so much of the teaching they get that they have become callous to the point where they don't know the difference between, and it's a mixture into the point where they can't discern where that gray area is. And many times I've brought up the subject of the levels of sin. In other words, in our society, if you shoplift, it's one, you get one kind of, I can't think of the word. You get convicted of this, and then if you do murder, you get a different conviction of that. And in our minds, in people's minds that don't saturate themselves with the word of God and not the world. In other words, we are in the world, not of the world. If we're doing so much mixture, do we become so callous that we can't tell the difference? And that's why they shut down the churches for 6 weeks. And the people, it's not that they've lost the word of God, but did they ever have the real word of God? As Yeshua says, you will be ever hearing but never understanding. You will be ever seeing but never perceiving. The people's hearts have become callous. They hardly hear with their ears and their eyes. So to me, and then he says, and turn and I will heal them. But you have to turn. You have to literally saturate yourself with the world of God, not the world outside of God. And there's so much to it, but I just can't fathom that. I guess I'm so far from. It's not that, like I watch some movies, like I go out into the world, but I really don't. I am to the point where I don't know of mixtures anymore. And so they shut down the churches for 6 weeks. Ain't no difference to me. I mean, I'm still serving God. It's one of the reasons I own the Messianic Lamb Network. It's ever before my face. I can't let it get out of my face. It has to be ever before my wife and I, and here it is. So anyway, that's what I have for that.
Well, and I love your point too. You choose, because it's still a choice, Mark. You choose
Sure.
whether you're in congregational setting or not to have his word, whether it's given through others or whether it's right, but it's ever before your face. Therefore, you're not going to stray to the right or the left, but you're going to maintain. And that's the difference. Most of the world has, this is going to be bad, but God in a box, and you only take him out on Sunday or Saturday. And therefore, when that day is not, and you only do it while you're meeting with other people. And when you're through meeting with other people, you put him back in the box and you'll pull him out the next week or next week. So Yahweh or God or Jesus or Yeshua remains packed away until the time you come together. And unfortunately, that is why we have what you were saying was, it is the glory of God to conceal a matter. It's the honor of kings to search it out. If we are kings and priests, we should be searching it out going into the deep waters. It's not enough that the water cover my ankles. It's not enough that the water cover my knees. I want to be completely saturated. And that desire is not there because the world's pull is so great. And that goes back with what we've been saying. They drink the Kool-Aid, they mix idolatry and you said you don't even understand mixture, not literally, but because you don't live it out. But in reality, that's not the case with most of the world. And, and thus we see the money changers in the house of Yahweh. We see people hearing but not truly understanding the depths of the word. And because of that, they're directionless, or they follow a direction that someone else leads instead of God. So,
well, you stop and think too. I was looking back at so the Jews said to him, and we're probably understanding being the leaders, the Sadducees, the people in authority, what sign do you show us for doing these things? And he gives them a parable. He won't even tell them straight out. In other words, kill me and I'll raise my body up again in 3 days. He doesn't say that. He speaks to them in a parable just in their answer, simply because they're going to, if he told them clearly they would take that and destroy it. They would take that and make it something that it's not, simply because they don't have the words of God in them. The world is supposed to bow down to them and be them instead of them bowing down to God. And I think the reason that he said that his disciples have, you guys have the word of God. You have these things in you, and I speak to you clearly because you do understand these things. But yet, some things he didn't. So I don't know. It's interesting that we just have to keep it ever before our face.
Ever before our face. Key. Very key.
Pinchas did.
Ever before his face. And that's why the zealousness of Yahweh was in him and upon him. The image of Yahweh was so much greater than the image of man, or the pressure of man, or the government around him, so to speak, that he acted upon what Yah's word said instead of the traditions and the pressure of society.
Right.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.
No one can come to you except through his love. Yeshua is the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to you except through his love. Torah, 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 Torah.